Hello and welcome back. So we're continuing to talk about what sorts of goods and services can or should be sold or bought. We're moving on from bodily organs and moving on to another controversial topic, which is a kind of bodily service, namely sex. So, should sex work be legal or illegal? Is sex work moral or immoral? And we're back. Here's Martha Nussbaum again. We saw her earlier on distributive justice, and now she's going to argue uh, basically in favor of sex work being legal or moral under certain conditions, and then we'll see another an opposing view in a future lecture. So the article is called "Whether from Reason or Prejudice, Taking Money for Bodily Services." So we're all, in some sense, body sellers if we earn a living or if we earn a wage. Some people do construction; they're using their body to swing hammers and pound in nails, and they get money for it. Some people are using their bodies to make hamburgers, some to clean bathrooms. A lot of us, the amount of bodily effort that we engage in is just pressing buttons on computers, but nonetheless, um, it counts as selling your body for money or the activities of your body for money. And some people perform sex acts for money. So this variety of, types of body selling, sometimes it makes more money, sometimes it makes less, sometimes it's prestigious, sometimes it's less prestigious, cleaning bathrooms, and then sometimes there's a significant social stigma associated with that activity, as in the case of sex work. So Nussbaum's going to argue that a social stigma on its own doesn't determine whether something is moral or immoral. Um, Sometimes that social stigma is well reasoned and comes from good reasons and good argumentation, and in other cases, uh, so a well-reasoned social stigma would be against, those people that call elderly people on the phone and try to scam them out of their money. If you knew someone who did that for a living, you would look down on them a bit, and for good reasons, right? What they're doing is immoral. But there are other cases where social stigma, particularly in the past, has attached to some sort of occupation. And now we look back and we say, well, that was actually not well reasoned. That was just mere prejudice. So, for example, Adam Smith, who's a famous economist from the 18th century, so the 1700s, uh, mentioned this because in his time, there were lots of activities that people engaged in, using their bodies that he notices, when it's done for free, like in the home, it's perfectly good, perfectly moral, right? Perfectly enjoyable. But when it's done for money, all of a sudden it becomes, uh, seems immoral or stigmatized, right? So, and he wasn't actually talking about sex work at this time. He was talking about things like singing and dancing. So at the time, being a professional actor or a singer or a performer was actually a low class profession and it was looked down on and it was in the same, uh, sort of tier as prostitution and sex work, right? So looking back on that, right now, actors and singers are, among the most elite in our society, the most well paid, uh, and most of us, I think, would consider that prejudice against, performing to be just that, a mere prejudice, just as we would look back on, the prejudices against people on racial or gender terms as mere prejudice and not well reasoned, right? We wouldn't look back at the pre-civil rights era and say, oh, that there was any good reasoning involved in, segregating bathrooms and restaurants and things like that. But additionally, we don't necessarily think of nowadays as singing in the home is somehow better or more pure or more elevated than singing, in a nightclub in front of other people or in a stadium, if you're a huge band. Um, we think that some of the best art, some of the highest art is publicly appreciated and performed publicly for large audiences. So we just don't have that same kind of stigma that existed in Smith's time. But when it comes to sex work, the stigma certainly still exists, right? Many people think that this sort of bodily activity should never be done for money. And there's a range of arguments. Some of the arguments come, I guess, maybe sort of from the right or from sort of a moral view that there's something about um, sex that is wrong or should only be done within certain confines within marriage. Uh, and then there are other attacks on sex work from the left, from sort of the feminist uh, scholarship that say, look, sex work is a form of male domination of women that manifests in other ways as well. Sometimes these same people will attack marriage as a kind of domination of women, or surrogate motherhood, hiring someone to carry your pregnancy for you, as all sort of forms of male domination of women that kind of share many things in common. So sex work is being attacked from many angles. Um, In either case, it seems that the argument is that sex is a sort of special kind of bodily activity that shouldn't be commodified. It shouldn't be exchanged for money, because, again, for various reasons, there's something wrong with that. And Nussbaum is asking, is this a reasoned opinion, right? Are there good reasons for this prejudice? And that's why it survived when our prejudice against, actors and singers, uh, professional actors and singers has gone away. Uh, or is this just another form of prejudice that, you know, if we examine the reasons, we realize we should get rid of it in the same way we got rid of our other prejudices? So, to start thinking about that, we might look back at these, the way performers were stigmatized in Smith's day and try to figure out what the reasons were and if they are in any way similar to the reasons that sex work is stigmatized. So, Nussbaum points out that even from the time even back to the ancient Greeks, up until the last century or so, among the aristocratic people who were the ones that were doing all the writing and moralizing and thinking because they had the free time to do it, uh, they placed a general kind of stigma on wage labor of any kind, right? So again, an aristocrat back in those days was supposed to be independently wealthy, typically because you owned a bunch of land, you had people working the land for you, and you collected rents or a percentage of the produce, and you didn't really have to do much labor apart from sort of managing your investments, right? So any sort of work you did, maybe you did some gardening, right? But that was supposed to be just for your personal pleasure and your personal enjoyment, and it would be demeaning to go garden for other people and get money for it. Similar with singing and dancing, all these uh, things you did were supposed to be purely for pleasure, and it was thought to be somehow made it more elevated and more spiritual, right? Even teaching, right? So uh, teaching philosophy, which was kind of the only subject in the really old days, that was also supposed to be done free of charge, because otherwise uh, it would somehow taint or cheapen this pursuit of truth, right? If I'm just doing it for money, well, I'm gonna maybe be a little lazy about it. It makes the whole process seem somehow uh, cheaper. Right? So, these attitudes, we don't have these same attitudes now, right? We tend to think that that's sort of an artifact of these folks just being a little too rich, maybe. Um, those attitudes were also tied up with anti-Semitism a bit. So, um, Jews were typically not among the aristocracy because there were fairly strict laws in most areas about, you know, whether Jews could own land or how much. And so they would often did have to go earn money to make a living. And so the sort of lower class people that were making money and Jews were sort of mixed together in the minds of these aristocrats. And so there's lots of sort of class privilege, right, and general uh, uh, it was a question of not stigma, prejudice. Sorry, prejudice that was going on in this stigmatization of labor in general, right? That today we think, well, no, there's nothing wrong with working for a living, so we just we usually have to. So, in addition to this stigma against just earning money from labor in general, was another stigma against just expressing yourself or displaying any sort of passion or emotion in public, right? And this was, again, just an artifact of the age. It's not necessarily how we feel these days. Um, Also, displaying emotion in public was kind of particularly associated with women who were thought to be whatever, more emotional and less rational at the time. And so this stuff like singing and acting and dancing and expressing yourself in public seemed sort of shameful and embarrassing. It was almost like just being naked in public. Uh, and so there were actors, right? But as you see in this photo, like in the days of Shakespeare, the female parts were played by men who dressed up in women's uh, costumes because women were prohibited from acting because um, it was a considered a sort of lowly profession anyways, and then women were largely the property of their husbands, and so they were uh, it was seemed definitely unseemly to have a woman on stage, right? So nowadays we don't think any of this makes good sense or is logical or correct in any way. They look like pretty narrow prejudices of a certain time. So again, the question is, what about sex work? Is that also a narrow prejudice of our time, or is it well reasoned? So in order to examine this question more and to help us sort of like sort out our intuitions about these things and examine them, uh, Nussbaum first describes 6 different types of ways someone might use their body for money. And we can think about, whether those feel right or wrong, and then try to examine why they seem right or wrong in each case and what sorts of things each of these cases have in common, and in particular in common or different from sex work. Right? So she considers a person who works in a factory plucking chickens all day, so very repetitive, boring, work done by hand. Um, someone who a housekeeper, right, or a maid, someone who goes to who works in another family's home, cleaning up after them. A nightclub singer who just sings in a club and takes requests occasionally from patrons. A philosophy professor who, you know, writes, publishes, does lectures, teaches for a living. A masseuse who, you know, gets in fairly intimate physical contact with other people, but it's not, it's definitely distinct from sex work. She's imagining, a whatever, a fancy masseuse, not there is blurred lines between massage parlors and sex work in our society, but she's thinking properly of just a masseuse that's not involved in any sex work. And then finally, this one's kind of strange. She sort of invents it, although it's, there are people that get money from doing medical experiments or engaging in, helping people test out equipment. So she's imagining a person who gets paid for testing out colonoscopy equipment. If you don't know what a colonoscopy is, it's when they put a camera inside your rectum up into to look for cancer, right? So it's done. I've had one. It's for done on men as a to prevent cancer, right? So she's imagining someone, probably maybe imagining a woman who's she's not doing the colonoscopies uh, for any it's not a routine checkup for her, but it's her job to help people test out the equipment, right? So we'll get into each of these in a little more detail and try to flesh out our intuitions about each and what are the factors that lead to those intuitions. So let's consider the factory work, right? So she's plucking chickens all day long in a factory, 8 hours a day, pretty repetitive, pretty boring. Um, it can, cause nerve damage. That kind of activity will harm your body over time. Um, so what are the what's going on with this job? How is it different than sex work? How is it the same as sex work? So, sex workers, prostitutes, uh, well, typically, so again, Nussbaum uses the term prostitute. I think the proper term is sex worker these days. You know, I won't be offended if you're not clear on which term to use or use different terms in the paper. I'm using kind of both because I'm channeling Nussbaum here as well, right? But so sex workers tend to make more money than a low-level factory worker. Uh, both jobs are physically hazardous. For sex workers, there's the fear of violence, right? They are beaten up and killed at rates that are uh, disturbing, right? That doesn't happen so much with uh, workers in factories. I mean, depending on the factory, there is the possibility of losing a limb or something in the machinery, or even dying. But the hazards, I think, are higher for sex workers, in large part because they don't have, OSHA, uh, right? The Occupational Safety Administration making sure that situation is as safe as possible. There's certainly more freedom for the sex worker, so she can arrange her day more or less as she likes. If she has a pimp, the pimp might be uh, restricting that freedom to some degree, but she could, take one client one day. She could take multiple clients in one day. She could take a day off, and it's more or less up to her what her schedule is. Not so for the factory worker, right? Um, Now, sex work, there are male sex workers, of course, um, but sex work is typically associated with women, and it's certainly um, a gendered sort of profession. Um, this is partly evidenced by the fact that often trans sex workers are subject to uh, higher risk of violence, right, because of this, uh, what some people perceive as a conflation of the gender codes, right, and stuff like that. So there's definitely some strict gender roles implicit in sex work, right? Not so for the factory worker, right? In some factories, if it's there have been factories where it's mostly women, right? Typically in garment manufacturers and stuff like that. But we're imagining this place is a chicken factory. Probably there's some male and some female chicken pluckers. Um, most, as we'll see with many of these professions, the one big difference from sex work is the factory worker does not have her bodily space invaded in the way that a sex worker would. And factory work is not stigmatized. It's not seen as immoral or degrading, right? It might seem like maybe a lower class occupation, for to upper class, upwardly mobile people, but they don't think that you're somehow bad for working in a factory. So those are, some of the details of the factory worker, some of the differences. But the sex worker will repeat this 5 more times for these different occupations she's imagining. So the housekeeper. So housekeeping does have a bit more class stigma associated with it. There is definitely a gender dynamic. So housekeepers tend to be female. They tend to be non-white, just statistically, and there is an association with it being a lower class, somehow cleaning up other people's dirt, right? Um, it's not seen as necessarily immoral, but there is a bit more of a stigma associated than maybe the factory worker. Right? There is some risk of violence. So, a woman entering somebody else's home, uh, it unprotected and unaccompanied there is some risk of violence, but it's certainly less than for the sex worker. And again, the housekeeper's bodily space is not invaded. The sex worker's certainly is as a matter of course. So the third occupation we're imagining is the nightclub singer. So the nightclub singer, like sex worker, is using her body to provide pleasure for the client. Listening to music is pleasurable. That's the reason we do it, right? And other forms of art as well. She takes requests, right? Um, sometimes. So she does, what's asked of her to produce the kind of pleasure that the client wants. Sometimes she uses her own ideas and artistry to get creative and please the clients in ways that they may not have expected. Uh, but of course, her bodily space is not invaded like the sex worker. She's not at very much risk of violence or health problems. Uh, you know, there's no smoking in clubs anymore. Uh, as long as she stays out of the alley late at night or something, she can be relatively safe. Singing is not particularly gender coded, right? Doesn't reinforce any particular gender stereotypes. There are plenty of male nightclub singers as well. And at least in our age, there's no particular stigma attached to being a singer. Of course, in Adam Smith's time, there would have been, right? But nowadays, not so much. On to the philosophy professor. So here it's interesting. So Nussbaum definitely has her own take on this, and she really tries hard um, to explain how being a philosophy professor is in some ways similar to being a sex worker. I'm interested in what you think. I don't completely buy it, right? So she says, for example, um, you can sometimes be talking about or expressing your thoughts, either in writing or in class about, you know, important or emotional or intimate or spiritual subject matter. It sort of depends on what sort of stuff you do. I do philosophy of mind, and I don't I get too emotional very often, but certainly it can happen, right? And more so in an ethics class. Um, and again, it was this sort of lofty, sort of spiritual nature of philosophy that did lead earlier cultures to say it's kind of unseemly to take money for it because it did have some sort of special valence of intimacy or importance, right? Um, so she may be right there. Um, the one point that maybe she stretches a little bit, she says, "Oh, my body is invaded as a philosophy professor because people put their ideas in my head." Um, I guess, right, in a sense, your brain is your body, and if somebody puts an idea in your brain in class, in discussion, the student raises their hand or at a conference, um, That's true of every profession, I would think, or even of just communication as a human being. Your mind is constantly invaded by other people's thoughts. Uh, so I don't know, maybe Nussbaum's right that there's some similarity with sex work. I'm not so sure about that one. Uh, a difference is, a good philosophy job is typically paid as well or better than sex worker. There's a large variation in the type of money that sex workers make. Um, some are very well paid and probably make much more than I do, um, and then some less so, right? There are certainly minimal risks to health or violence, and there's no social stigma, I don't think, of any kind involved in being a professor. If anything, um, there's a certain degree of respect. And philosophy isn't reinforcing any gender stereotypes, I don't think. If anything, there's a stereotype, perhaps, that the philosopher or that the professor would be male. Um, so if, Nussbaum is teaching, she's not somehow reinforcing some pernicious gender thing. She's probably on the side of the good in that respect. So the other occupation, considering is a masseuse. So, the thing about the masseuse is she touches her client a lot. There's a lot of bodily contact, right? And she'll touch, she has to massage uh, borderline erogenous zones, right? And the person getting the massage will get pleasure from it, and that pleasure may even border on the erotic, or depending on the person, they may get a lot of erotic pleasure from it, even though she's not, touching genitals or anything like that. But nonetheless, her job is well paid and doesn't have any particular social stigma. Now that's been in part the result of masseuses working very hard to you know get their profession to be seen on the same level as other health workers and to get the stigma gone away, and that's been largely uh, successful, right? So here we have a masseuse who's like pretty intimate physical contact with a client, but no real social stigma at all. And then we have the colonoscopy artist. So here, Nussbaum is, I don't think this job exists. Maybe someone has done this before, but she's imagining somebody who makes a living letting scientists try out colonoscopy equipment on her. So, it is inserted in the rectum. It goes even deeper than anything would be inserted in normal sexual activity. So her bodily space is definitely invaded, right? So this is something that all of the other professions did not involve, but this one does, um, like sex work. Uh, but she argues we wouldn't think of this job as morally degrading in any way. We wouldn't think that there's any particular stigma attached to this profession, right? Certainly not in the way you would or people do of sex work. There's no particular gender stereotype in play here. We can imagine this person being a man or a woman just as easily. So the point, I think, obviously, of examining this sort of occupation is to say that bodily penetration is not in itself the deciding factor on why sex work is stigmatized, right? You can have your body penetrated for money in ways that are not socially stigmatizing. So, of all these, some had various degrees of social stigma, but sex work by far the greatest amount of stigma attached, right? And the question is, why is this the case? Sex work is the only one considered to be immoral, right? Even the housekeeper, which sometimes by some people might consider it a lower class job, is still not considered immoral or wrong. Um, Sex work is definitely the one most tied up with the gender stereotypes. Uh, so, how could we explain this stigma? Well, again, it can come from two sides. Um, One explanation, which is no longer believed by most people, would be that look, women's sexuality needs to be controlled and subjected to male dominance, right? And part of this is to make sure that prostitutes exist as an outlet for men's sexuality, but that they are kept on such a low moral rung that that sort of open female sexuality um, does not become threatening to the general male approach, which is to, marry a woman and own her sexuality, right? So that's a very old-fashioned view that certainly some people might have even espoused, but I don't think anybody would espouse that view today, right? So the other option for explaining the social stigma comes from more recent feminist scholarship. So we're going to examine that. So feminists have argued that sex work is wrong because It is the result of and reinforces a negative gender dynamic, um, right, enforced by a male hierarchy that it robs women of their subjectivity and makes them objects of male desire, right? So saying your worth is only as a sexual object, and and sex work is sort of the ultimate form of that, although it also manifests sometimes often in marriages and other male-female dynamics. Right? So that certainly is a rational argument that makes sense, right? But it doesn't quite explain the stigma, right? So if that is true, then if anything, we ought to um, have sympathy and pity for the sex worker, not think of them as somehow morally degraded, right? So where does the stigma come from? Well, in the feminist scholarship, the stigma comes um, from the threat men feel by this free sexuality of the sex worker, right? So back to the other explanation, that is still a thing, right? Men don't want women, and again, I'm talking in generalities, but this is sort of broadly the current that came through the feminist scholarship, right? Was that uh, men or the male dominated society doesn't want women's sexuality to be too free, and so uh, the stigma comes then from the hierarchy, from the male dominated society to keep sex workers in their place, more or less, right? Available for men to exploit, but not threatening to male domination. Well, if that's the case, then the stigma involved is coming from the patriarchy, right? It's not uh, coming from any good reasons, right? And so, if anything, uh, you might think that this feminist critique of sex work would give us good reason not to make sex work illegal, but instead to bring it out in the open, right? Because it's again, the patriarchy that wants it in the shadows. So you can see Nussbaum starting to move towards, the idea that she can't really find actually any good reasons uh, to make sex work illegal or to stigmatize it in any way, right? Um, and so now she's going to consider 7 different arguments for the criminalization of sex work, and she's going to say each one doesn't work, right? So number one, sex work involves risks of violence and to health. This is absolutely true, right? Sex workers are at risk of violence and death. She argues that this is largely because sex work is illegal and unregulated, right? There are areas where it is legal and regulated, and those risks are brought down, way down, right? And so, can you eliminate all risks? Well, no, not in any job, right? Working in a factory also, you have the risk of being hurt or killed, right? But she argues if you made sex work legal and well regulated, uh, you could get the risks down to the acceptable level that we take for any other job. The second argument for making sex work illegal is that sex work robs women of their autonomy, right? Now, Nussbaum argues all jobs rob you of some of your autonomy, right? You are selling your time and your bodily activity to someone else, right? That's why people, hate going to work, right? It's time you could have been spending on something you wanted to do, and you're doing what your boss wants you to do, right? Um, and anyway, making sex work illegal isn't going to make sex workers more autonomous, right? So she dismisses that argument. Argument number 3 says sex work involves invasion of personal space, right? So this is true, right? There are very few occupations where your body is penetrated, right? Um, except for, the one she described, the colonoscopy artist, right? So if you don't think that um, taking money for having, right, colonoscopy equipment tested out on you should be illegal, then we can't say sex work is illegal for that same reason. Number 4, the argument is that prostitution disrupts natural personal relationships. So Anderson is her opponent here she's thinking of, and we'll read something from Anderson later. I think the general idea is like sex is supposed to be the special thing. It's a bonding experience between people in a relationship. And so selling sex on the free market disrupts these sort of relationships. It's a problem for uh, the woman selling the sex. It's a problem for the clients, right? In either way, it makes maintaining sort of the proper sort of sexual relationships more difficult. Um, Nussbaum argues that this is not the case, right? That you can still have the real thing even when sort of cheapened versions exist, right? You can still enjoy Proust, who's whatever, supposed to be a great writer, right? Even when cheap romance novels are out there, but that doesn't mean that great art becomes impossible, right? Should we make pop music illegal in order to force people to appreciate Beethoven? She argues no, and so uh, this argument number four, she thinks doesn't work either. Argument number five, the sex worker turns her sexuality into a commodity. This is certainly true, right? She's selling sex, she's getting money for sex, so sex is a commodity that's exchanged. But again, we commodify many of our bodily activities, right? That's what a job is. Uh, so is there something special about the sex work that particularly, you know, uh, that does something to sexuality by making it a commodity that somehow ruins it? She says, I don't see why the sex worker can still have sex on her own time. It's not that it's been taken away from her. Her sexuality doesn't go away. And likewise, is a singer doing something wrong when she uses her voice for money? Um, the other argument might be that, well, by turning something into a commodity, you've turned it into something that's like sort of interchangeable, right? So, this computer, I could get another computer that's identical and nothing would have been lost. But, the argument is, well, your sexuality shouldn't be like that. It should be unique and personal to you. And she doesn't think that's true of the sex worker, right? Not every sex worker is the same. Now, maybe they're more interchangeable than, I don't know, pop singers or something, right? If, depending on what the client wants out of it. Uh, a certain client might not care that much, right, between different sex workers. Others might very much, right? They might be very much um, interested in what one sex worker can provide over all the others, right? So it's not clear, at least, that she's turned her sexuality into some sort of interchangeable commodity like you would boxes of cereal, right? Um, at any rate, the overall point is surely taking money for an activity does not in itself make that um, immoral, right? Commodification as such is not immoral. So you'd have to say something more to say that commodifying your sexuality is immoral. Number six, the argument is sex work perpetuates male dominance. Um, Nussbaum says, yes, this is certainly true, right? It does perpetuate this view of women as objects, right? Of sex objects, um, and their sexuality is sort of divorced from anything about their personality largely, or as people, right? Men are just buying the sex from them. Um, and this is an unsavory sort of dynamic. But she says, look, this has been happening since forever, right? Marriage was a way of perpetuating male dominance, right, for generations and thousands of years. Um, Dowries, which I don't know if you're familiar with dowries. She talks a lot about dowries, but the idea was, if you have male children, they can work your farm and they're useful. But in the past, people thought of female children as not particularly useful. So um, your father would have to pay a dowry to somebody else, right? Money or a cow or something of value to get them to marry you, right? So you could sort of unload your quote useless female children on somebody else, right? So that practice has had all sorts of terrible um, knock-on effects. So people will, marry a woman just to get the dowry and then kill her and stuff like that. So um, yeah, point being, yes, sex work perpetuates male dominance. So does so many other things in our society, right? And in any case, um, if that is the case, making sex work illegal doesn't help, right? That just leaves women open to more exploitation by putting it on the black market, right, underground. Uh, and anyways, even if marriage does have these pernicious effects, no one would say we should outlaw marriage, right? That would seem somehow an infringement of personal liberty to say, sorry, you cannot get married, right? Uh, so while number six may be true, it's not particular to sex work, and she doesn't think it's a good rationale for making sex work illegal. All right, and the last argument, which is, look, no one would ever freely choose to do sex work, therefore, right, it should be illegal. Um, so certainly lots of people that are involved in sex work are coerced, kidnapped, right, forced into situations that they wouldn't have chosen for themselves. And even some often women who seem to have sort of freely chosen it are doing it in a context where they just didn't have really any other options, right? And that's not exactly freedom or autonomy either, right? Um, but she thinks that the blame for that is largely laid on the society, right? People shouldn't be put in those situations. So certainly people shouldn't be kidnapped and coerced and forced into sex work, obviously, but also people shouldn't be so poor that sex work is their only option to make a living, right? So she says the problem isn't about the freedom or the problem isn't the sex work. The problem is the lack of freedom, right? It's the external conditions. So what we should want to do is give women options, right? Through education, through help starting businesses, loans, um, freeing them from sort of tyrannical situations, right? Um, so she says, really, when we're talking about, and this is the main point of her article, if I'm going to summarize, is that when we start talking about sex work, right, what we end up really talking about is economic conditions of women, right, in political conditions. And she says that's really what we should be talking about and what we should be working on as philosophers and academics and social activists is fixing these situations for women to give them autonomy, not just arguing that sex work is immoral and should be illegal, right? Okay, so that is Nussbaum's argument, and we'll see you next time.